My Aunt Margaret lifted my gift with 2 fingers like it might contaminate her. "Well, we know who's spent the least," she announced to the cluster of relatives examining the gift table at my cousin Elena's wedding reception, her voice pitched to carry across 3 nearby tables. "Look how small it is compared to everything else. I suppose not everyone understands the importance of generosity at family weddings." A woman at the next table, someone's colleague I think, let out a snort she tried to disguise as a cough. 2 of my uncles exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared judgment about my inadequate contribution. My own mother wouldn't meet my eyes, her embarrassment about her daughter's cheap gift evident in how she suddenly became very interested in the centerpiece flowers. I sat at a back corner table in my altered bridesmaid dress, the only one Elena could find on clearance that fit the color scheme, watching my small wrapped box become the subject of family commentary and social judgment. What none of them knew was that inside that modest package was something that would either heal a decades-old family wound or expose secrets that would shatter tonight's celebration completely. Drop a comment if you've ever given a meaningful gift that looked inadequate to people who measure generosity by price tags. This story is about what actually matters. My name is Sophie Castellano. I'm 29 years old, and I've spent most of my life being the broke cousin at wealthy family gatherings, while my relatives discussed investments and vacation homes, and the generous wedding gifts they could afford to give. What they saw as financial failure, I knew was the result of choices and circumstances they'd never bothered to understand. The Castellano family had always been about appearances, success, and maintaining the image of prosperity that my grandfather Antonio had built when he'd emigrated from Italy in 1952, with nothing but carpentry skills and determination to eat something lasting for his descendants. He'd established Castellano Construction, which his 4 sons had expanded into a company that now employed 200 people and generated $45 million annually. Most of the extended family had benefited directly from this success, working for the family business, inheriting property Grandpa Antonio had purchased, or receiving financial support that made their own ventures possible. My father Vincent had been the exception. He'd died in a construction accident when I was 3 years old, before the company had become as profitable as it eventually would. Mom had received a settlement from workers' compensation, but it had been modest compared to the wealth other family members would later accumulate. She'd worked as a medical receptionist while raising me alone, living carefully on her $42,000 salary and the monthly widow benefits that supplemented our income. We'd attended family gatherings where everyone else discussed their second homes, their children's private school educations, and the European vacations they took annually. We'd smiled through conversations about investments and property portfolios, while quietly calculating whether we could afford to contribute to the extended family gift funds that seemed to grow larger every year. My cousin Elena, whose wedding we were currently attending, was the daughter of my father's brother Michael, one of the sons who'd helped expand Castellano Construction into its current success. Elena had grown up with every advantage: private schools, study abroad experiences, a college education fully funded by her parents, and a $50,000 down payment gift for her first home purchased at 25. Meanwhile, I'd attended public schools, worked multiple jobs throughout college to minimize student loans, graduated with $73,000 in debt, and was currently living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a questionable neighborhood because it was what I could afford on my $58,000 salary as a social worker serving foster children. The economic disparity had always been visible, but had become painfully obvious during wedding planning, when Elena had asked me to be a bridesmaid, an honor that came with a $300 dress, $150 for hair and makeup, a contribution to the bachelorette party weekend in Napa that had cost $800, and the expectation that I'd give a generous wedding gift appropriate to our family's status. I'd maxed out a credit card covering the bridesmaid expenses, skipping 2 months of student loan payments to make it work, and had been stressing about the wedding gift for weeks because I knew anything less than $500 would be noticed and judged by relatives who discussed gift amounts as indicators of family loyalty and financial stability. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever been judged for what you couldn't afford by people who never asked about your actual circumstances. You need to hear what was in that box. The wedding had been exactly the kind of lavish celebration I'd expected. Ceremony at a historic mission, reception at a vineyard estate, 220 guests, 7-course dinner, live band, and every detail reflecting the substantial budget Michael and his wife Patricia had provided for their only daughter's special day. The gifts displayed on the designated table told their own story about family hierarchy and financial capability. My Uncle Roberto and his wife had given a full set of Le Creuset cookware, the tag still attached showing the $2,400 retail price. My Aunt Francesca had gifted a crystal chandelier for Elena's new house, $1,800 according to the card that helpfully specified the amount. Cousin Marco had contributed an envelope that I'd overheard him telling another guest contained $3,000 cash. And then there was my gift, a small box, about 6 inches square, wrapped in simple paper because I couldn't afford the expensive wrapping service the other gifts had obviously received. It looked pitiful next to the elaborate packages, the large boxes, the envelopes stuffed with cash and checks that represented family members' ability to give generously without financial strain. I'd known it would look inadequate. I'd anticipated the judgment, but the gift inside wasn't something I could have afforded to replace with cash or expensive household items, and its significance had nothing to do with monetary value. Aunt Margaret's public mockery of my contribution had occurred during cocktail hour, when guests were mingling and examining the gift table before dinner service began. She'd been holding court with a group of family friends, pointing out particularly generous gifts and offering commentary about who had given what. The Castellano family takes care of each other, she'd been explaining to some of Elena's college friends, who'd expressed amazement at the expensive gifts. We believe in celebrating important milestones appropriately, with generosity that reflects our family values. Then she spotted my small box, picked it up with exaggerated delicacy, and made her announcement about knowing who'd spent the least. The mockery had been deliberate and public, designed to establish hierarchy and remind everyone that not all family members had achieved equal success or demonstrated equal generosity. I'd watched from my assigned table, cheeks burning, as people examined my inadequate contribution and exchanged knowing looks about the broke cousin who couldn't manage appropriate gift-giving, despite being a bridesmaid in the wedding. My mother had leaned over, whispering urgently, "Sophie, what did you give her? Please tell me it's not something homemade or a donation in her name. Not at this wedding, with this family. It's wedding, with this family." "Exactly what Elena needs," I'd replied quietly, not willing to explain further because doing so would have required revealing things I wasn't sure Elena wanted her parents, or the extended family to know. The gift opening had been scheduled to occur after dinner, before dancing began, a traditional element that Michael and Patricia had insisted on despite Elena's visible discomfort with the idea. I'd understood her reluctance. Public gift opening meant public comparison of who'd given what, public acknowledgement of generosity or its absence, public performance of gratitude that would inevitably favor the relatives who'd spent most. Impressively. Share this video if you've watched gift giving become a competition rather than a gesture. This moment was about to expose what actually mattered. After dinner concluded and tables were cleared for dancing, Michael had taken the microphone to announce the gift opening ceremony. "Elena and Thomas want to thank everyone for their incredible generosity," he'd begun, gesturing toward the gift table where packages were arranged in order of size. "We're going to open a few gifts now so they can express their appreciation directly." What followed was exactly the kind of performative gratitude I'd anticipated. Elena and her new husband Thomas opened the Le Creuset cookware, set with appropriate enthusiasm. They admired the crystal chandelier with suitable amazement. They opened envelope after envelope, announcing amounts with embarrassed smiles, while guests applauded generosity that reflected family status and financial capability. $3,000 from cousin Marco, Thomas had announced, waving the check while people clapped. "Wow, this is incredibly generous. Thank you so much." The pattern continued through approximately 15 gifts, large packages, expensive items, substantial checks, each opening accompanied by expressions of gratitude and family members beaming with pride about their impressive contributions. Then Elena reached for my small box. I watched her pick it up, feeling my stomach clench as I anticipated the moment when she'd open it in front of 220 guests and reveal whatever disappointingly modest gift the broke cousin had managed to provide. She carefully removed the simple wrapping paper, opened the plain cardboard box, and withdrew a single folded document. Her expression shifted from polite anticipation to confusion as she unfolded the paper and began reading whatever was printed there. I watched her face transform, confusion melting into shock, shock crystallizing into something that looked like she couldn't breathe, her hands beginning to shake as she continued reading. She looked up at me, eyes filling with tears, then back down at the document, then up at me again with wetness spilling down her cheeks. The room didn't just go quiet, it fractured into confused silence as 220 guests tried to understand what was happening, and why the bride was weeping while holding a single piece of paper that should have been a gift receipt or card. Sophie, Elena's voice cracked with emotion. Is this real? Can you actually do this? Thomas took the document from her trembling hands, read it himself, and looked at me with an expression that cycled through disbelief, gratitude, and something close to awe. What is it? Patricia called from a nearby table, maternal concern mixing with confusion about why her daughter was crying over what appeared to be a document rather than an expensive gift. Elena crossed the dance floor, abandoning protocol entirely, walking directly to where I sat at my back corner table. She pulled me into a hug so fierce I struggled to breathe, crying against my shoulder while 220 guests watched in complete bafflement. Thank you, she whispered against my ear. You're the only one who knew. The only one who understood what I actually needed. Type understood if you're ready to learn what was in that document. This is where hidden realities became undeniable. Elena returned to the gift table, still clutching the document, her tears now under control, but her voice shaking with emotion as she took the microphone from her bewildered father. I need to explain something, she began, looking at me rather than the assembled guests. 6 months ago I received news that changed everything about my future and my ability to build the family Thomas and I had been planning. The room held its collective breath, everyone riveted by Elena's emotional state and the mysterious document that had triggered this departure from standard wedding reception protocol. I was diagnosed with stage 3. Endometriosis. Severe scarring, adhesions on multiple organs, and significant fertility complications. My doctor told me that without immediate surgical intervention, my chances of ever conceiving naturally were essentially 0. And even with surgery, the odds weren't good. Whispered exclamations rippled through the crowd. Patricia stood up abruptly, her face showing she hadn't known about this diagnosis. Michael looked equally stunned, his father of the bride confidence completely disrupted. I didn't tell most of the family because I didn't want my medical crisis to overshadow wedding planning, or become everyone's business to discuss and dissect. Only Thomas knew, and Sophie. I told Sophie because she's a social worker, and I needed someone who understood medical trauma without judgment or unsolicited advice. She looked down at the diagnosis document in her hands, fresh tears welling. The specialist recommended immediate excision surgery, a complex procedure that would remove the endometrial tissue and adhesions, potentially restoring some fertility function. But the surgery cost $32,000, which insurance classifies as fertility treatment and won't cover. Thomas and I have been trying to save, but between the house down payment, wedding expenses and student loans, we were looking at maybe being able to afford the surgery in 3 or 4 years. The silence shifted as people began connecting Elena's medical situation to the document she was holding, and the emotional breakdown it had triggered. Sophie gave me this, Elena said, holding up the paper so people could see official letterhead. It's a receipt confirming full payment for the excision surgery at Boston Center for Endometriosis. $32,000, paid in full yesterday, with my name listed as the patient and surgery scheduled for next month. Stunned silence gave way to audible gasps. People's faces registered them processing the same impossible calculation I'd been wrestling with for months. How did a broke social worker making $58,000 annually afford to pay $32,000 for her cousin's medical treatment? Sophie lives in a tiny apartment, and drives a car that's held together with duct tape and prayer. Elena continued, her voice strengthening. She's been the broke cousin our entire lives while the rest of the family built wealth through the business Grandpa started. But she's also the only person who understood what this diagnosis meant to me, emotionally, and the only person who did something concrete to solve the actual problem rather than offering sympathy. Patricia had started crying, harsh, gasping. Sobs that suggested complicated emotions about learning her daughter's medical crisis, publicly, and discovering that a niece she'd probably dismissed as unsuccessful had paid for treatment the family didn't know was needed. "Where did you get $32,000? Someone called out, one of the uncles, his voice carrying genuine confusion about how this financial miracle was possible. Elena looked at me, silently asking permission to explain what I'd never told the family. I nodded slightly, knowing the truth would emerge now, regardless of my preferences. Sophie's father, my Uncle Vincent, died in a construction accident at a Castellano construction job site when Sophie was 3 years old, Elena said, addressing the relatives who already knew this history. What most of you don't know is that the accident happened because of safety violations that made the company liable. There was a wrongful death settlement, a significant one. Uncomfortable shifting rippled through the crowd. This was family history that had apparently been kept quiet, never discussed at gatherings where Castellano Construction's success was celebrated. The settlement included 2 parts, Elena continued, reading from notes she must have prepared in case she needed to explain this publicly. Workers' compensation that Sophie's mother received, about $200,000 paid out over time, and a wrongful death judgment against Castellano Construction for $1.20 million that was supposed to be held in trust for Sophie until she turned 25. My uncle's faces registered recognition. They knew this history, had hoped it will remain buried. When Sophie turned 25 4 years ago, she discovered that the trust had been dissolved in 2008 during the recession. The money that was supposed to be protected for the daughter of the man who died due to company safety failures had been absorbed into business operations to prevent Castellano Construction from going bankrupt. Drop dissolved if you believe. The cruelest betrayals are the ones family commits while calling it business necessity. This truth had been buried for years. The revelation detonated. Relatives who'd been judging my cheap gift minutes earlier now understood that the family business they'd all profited from had been saved using money intended for the orphan daughter of a man who'd died because the company cut safety core. Nerez. My mother buried her face in her hands. My uncle sat frozen, unable to deny what Elena was revealing, because it was documented truth I'd discovered through legal records. Sophie could have sued to recover the money, Elena said, her voice steady now. She consulted with attorneys who told her she had a strong case for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion of trust funds. The lawyers estimated she could recover the original $1.20 million plus interest and penalties, probably over $2 million total at this point. She paused, letting that number settle over the crowd, $2 that I could have pursued but hadn't. But Sophie didn't sue. She didn't want to destroy the family business that employs half our relatives and supports all the lifestyle everyone in this room enjoys. She didn't want to bankrupt the company Grandpa built, even though that company had stolen her inheritance and everyone had been perfectly happy pretending it never happened. Patricia approached Elena, trying to process what she was learning. Elena, honey, if Sophie didn't recover the trust money, how did she pay for your surgery? Because Sophie did something nobody in this family knows about, Elena said, looking at me with expression mixing gratitude and something like vindication. She spent 4 years researching the accident that killed her father. She obtained investigation reports, safety inspection records, witness statements, and documentation about the violations that caused his death. My chest tightened. This was the part I'd never intended to become public knowledge. Last year, Sophie used that research to file a claim with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, documenting that Castellano Construction had a pattern of safety violations extending back decades. Violations that had resulted in multiple injuries and 1 death, but that the company had managed to keep quiet through settlements and legal maneuvering. My uncles had gone pale. This wasn't just family history. This was regulatory exposure that could affect their business licenses and insurance coverage. OSHA investigated and found sufficient evidence to impose penalties. Rather than going through the full enforcement process, the company opted to settle. Sophie received a settlement payment of $450,000 in exchange for agreeing not to pursue further regulatory complaints or civil litigation. So that's where people thought I'd gotten the money. The truth was actually simpler and more complicated than Elena apparently understood, but the OSHA settlement story would serve as explanation that protected information I still wasn't ready to share publicly. Sophie used that settlement money, compensation for her father's death and the family's safety failures, to pay for my surgery, Elena concluded. She gave me the chance to possibly have children someday, using money she got from forcing the family to finally acknowledge what happened to her dad. The silence was profound and uncomfortable. 220 guests processing that the small cheap gift had actually been $32,000, paid from settlement money the family business had been forced to pay after stealing the original trust fund. Comment forced if you understand that sometimes justice requires making people uncomfortable. This exposure was changing everything. The remainder of the evening became a blur of conversations I couldn't fully process. Relatives approached me in waves, some apologizing for judging my gift, others expressing shock about the trust fund theft, many clearly calculating their own moral culpability in a system that had benefited them while excluding me. Aunt Margaret appeared at my table during coffee service, her earlier mockery now transformed into visible discomfort. "Sophie, I had no idea about the trust fund or the settlement. If you'd known, you might not have publicly mocked my gift." I interrupted quietly. "The problem isn't that you didn't know my financial history, Aunt Margaret. The problem is that you measured the value of my gift by its packaging, rather than considering that maybe generosity looks different when you're working with different resources." She left without responding, unable to defend judgment that had been revealed as cruel and ignorant. My mother was more direct, pulling me aside during the reception's final hour without tears streaming down her face. "Sophie, why didn't you tell me you'd filed the OSHA complaint and gotten a settlement? I thought you'd just accepted that the trust money was gone. Because talking about Dad's death and the safety violations meant reliving trauma you'd worked hard to move past," I said gently. "And because forcing the family to pay for their failures felt like betraying Grandpa's legacy and hurting relatives who weren't directly responsible for what happened, but they stole your inheritance. They made a business decision during a financial crisis, Mom. It was wrong, but I understand why it happened. What hurt more was that nobody ever acknowledged it or apologized or offered to make it right once the company recovered. They just pretended it never happened and let me be the broke cousin while everyone else prospered." Uncle Michael approached us, his father of the bride confidence completely shattered. "Sophie, I need you to know that I fought against dissolving the trust. I was outvoted by my brothers, and I've regretted not fighting harder ever since." I wanted to be angry, but his obvious guilt made it difficult. "Uncle Michael, what's done is done. I'm not trying to punish anyone or demand repayment. I just paid for Elena's surgery because she needed it and I had resources nobody knew about. That's all this was supposed to be. But the public nature of the revelation had made it more than a private medical gift. It had exposed family secrets, challenged assumptions about success and failure, and forced uncomfortable reckonings with the moral compromises that had funded everyone's prosperity." Thomas, Elena's new husband, found me as guests were beginning to depart. "Sophie, I don't know how to thank you. You've given us something we couldn't have afforded for years, the chance to possibly have the family we've been dreaming about. Just take care of Elena during her recovery, and be patient with whatever outcomes the surgery produces," I lied. "Endometriosis doesn't always respond perfectly to treatment, but at least now you'll have given her the best medical chance possible." The most unexpected response came from my grandfather's widow, Grandma Rosa, who'd remarried after Grandpt. Antonio died and who'd been sitting quietly throughout the evening observing family dynamics. She approached me during the coat collection, her expression thoughtful. "Sophie, your grandfather would have been ashamed of what his sons did with your trust fund," she said bluntly. "Antonio built that business to take care of family, not to steal from orphan children. If he were alive, he'd have made sure you were compensated properly." The validation from someone who'd known Grandpa intimately was unexpectedly healing. "Thank you, Grandma Rosa. That means more than you probably know." Type healing if you believe the best gifts address needs people are afraid to voice. Elena got surgery, but I got validation I hadn't known I needed. 3 months after the wedding, Elena underwent the excision surgery at Boston Center for endometriosis. The procedure was complex and took longer than expected, but the surgeon reported that they'd successfully removed the endometrial tissue and adhesions, restoring normal anatomy and potentially improving her fertility prospects significantly. Why? Well, recovery was difficult. 6 weeks of restricted activity, ongoing pain management, hormonal treatments to prevent recurrence. But Elena approached it with determination fueled by hope that this intervention might make pregnancy possible in ways it hadn't been before. 6 months post-surgery, Elena called with news that made the entire ordeal worthwhile. She was pregnant. Naturally, without IVF or fertility treatments. Just her body functioning the way the surgery had been intended to allow. "Sophie, I'm pregnant," she'd said, her voice breaking with joy and disbelief. "The surgery worked. My body is actually doing what it's supposed to do. I am going to have a baby." The phone call had lasted 2 hours, with Elena describing every detail of the positive pregnancy test, the confirming blood work, the ultrasound that showed a healthy gestational sac, and the overwhelming emotion of discovering that the surgery I'd funded had given her exactly what she'd hoped for. But the most significant outcome of the wedding gift revelation wasn't Elena's pregnancy. It was what happened to the Castellano family dynamics and business practices in the months following the public exposure of the trust fund dissolution. My uncles had collectively approached me 6 weeks after the wedding with a proposal that had clearly required difficult negotiations among themselves. They'd agreed to repay the original $1.20 million trust fund amount plus 18 years of compound interest, calculated at 6% annually, totaling approximately $3.40 million. "We can't undo what we did," Uncle Michael had explained during the meeting where they'd presented this offer. "But we can acknowledge that dissolving your trust fund was wrong, and we can make financial restitution for the inheritance you should have received." I'd accepted the repayment, not because I needed the money but because their willingness to make restitution represented acknowledgement of wrongdoing that mattered more than the dollars involved. The family had also established the Vincent Castellano Memorial Safety Foundation, funded with $500,000 from company profits, dedicated to improving construction safety standards and providing support to families affected by workplace accidents. My father's death, which had been quietly buried and never publicly acknowledged, was now commemorated through work that would prevent similar tragedies. But perhaps most importantly, Castellano Construction had implemented comprehensive safety reforms that went beyond regulatory minimums, hired an independent safety director, and established protocols that prioritized worker protection over cost savings and schedule pressures. The company that had cut corners resulting in my father's death was now an industry leader in construction safety. The wedding gift that had looked inadequate and cheap had become a catalyst for family healing, business reform, and the kind of honest reckoning that's only possible when secrets are exposed in contexts where people can't ignore or dismiss them. Elena's baby, a girl she named Sophia Rose, was born healthy 9 months after that positive pregnancy test. I attended the birth as a witness to the medical miracle my gift had made possible, holding my new second cousin and understanding that sometimes the most valuable things we can give each other can't be measured in dollars or wrapped in NC paper. Tell me about a time when you gave a gift that looked inadequate to others but carried significance they couldn't see, or when you discovered that financial success had been built on moral compromises nobody wanted to acknowledge. How did those revelations change your understanding of what actually matters? And what would you say to someone who's being judged for what they can't afford by people who never asked about their circumstances?